I'm going to return to the territory and possibly even the question that we looked at yesterday with regard to Glastonbury and the punk rap act Bob Vylan's calls for, quotes, death to the IDF, end quotes. And the reason is that some of the stuff that we touched on yesterday has become even more pertinent, I think, today. Yesterday evening, or sort of late afternoon yesterday, quite a few of you got in touch with me to point out that the BBC's website had two stories adjacent to each other. So if you were looking at it on your phone or if you were looking at it online, then these two stories would have appeared to have had equal and opposite force. And even as a relatively seasoned media professional, I was genuinely taken aback by it, so much so that I wondered whether we got a few things wrong yesterday when we were discussing this. And these are the two stories that sat next to each other on every screen in Britain that was minded to tune into the BBC's website at the same moment, okay? Story number one, police launch criminal investigation into Bob Vylan and kneecap Glastonbury sets. Story number two, Israeli strike on Gaza seafront cafe kills at least 20 Palestinians, witnesses and rescuers say. We can provide a little bit more detail on that and say including women and children. The Israeli military later said it had struck several Hamas terrorists in northern Gaza. This isn't necessarily relevant to the seafront cafe, and that it was reviewing the incident. But of course, I think you'll allow me to say that they always say that. And they continue to say it until, for example, footage turns up in the phone of a murdered aid worker that completely contradicts their version of events. So that is something that I think a reasonably minded observer will really struggle to compute. How can those two stories appear on the same planet in ways that make them look similar and comparable? Police launch criminal investigation into Bob Vylan and kneecap Glastonbury sets. And then right next to it, Israeli strike on Gaza seafront cafe kills at least 20 Palestinians, witnesses and rescuers say. A cafe, a school, food distribution sites in Gaza. Other estimates put the overall total at about 95. A hospital was attacked. At least 62 of the victims of Monday's attacks were in Gaza City and the north of the territory. This includes 39 people, Al Jazeera reports today, killed in an Israeli strike on a seaside cafe, with dozens more wounded. Journalists dead, women dead, children dead. One witness said that Israeli fighter jets carried out the strike. We found people torn apart, says an eyewitness. This place wasn't affiliated with anyone, no politics and no military association whatsoever. It was packed with people, including children, for a birthday party. And Hani Mahmoud, reporting from Gaza City for Al Jazeera, where, I would remind you, LBC are not permitted to send journalists, said the attack on the cafe occurred, quotes, without any warning. This area serves as a refuge for many traumatized and displaced people, offering some relief from the oppressive heat of the tents. The tents, if you need me to remind you, are their homes, because they have either been displaced from their homes or their homes have been destroyed, or both. Most likely both. The bloodstains are still everywhere given the intensity of the explosion. Some of the bodies and pieces of flesh were collected from the flood of this place. Food distribution warehouse in the Zaytun neighbourhood of Gaza City killed at least 13 people, saw at least 13 people killed while they were trying to get rations. And despite the very best efforts of the Israeli regime to limit access to this sort of information, we live in a world where it is easily accessible. I mean, you could find the story of at least 20 Palestinians being killed in an attack upon a cafe on the BBC. But most people who are interested in this issue, in this continuing catastrophe, most people will be accessing other news sources as well. And that's why I sense an epic confusion among perfectly decent people about how on earth comments by a musical artiste, provocative and it is for an investigation to decide whether or not they were insightful. I don't personally think that the investigation will find that they were, for reasons that I explained yesterday. But I think I'll explain again, because you can make a very good living pretending not to understand this and offering articles to the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail at the moment. I'm going to read you the letters page of the Times shortly, because that is really interesting. Times 2 weeks ago, of course, was paying a former Israeli defence minister currently wanted by the International Criminal Court on war crime allegations, paying him for his opinions in column form in the newspaper. But the letters pages are quite an eye-opener today. But the reason why I don't think it will be found to be insightful is because there is absolutely no likelihood, as far as I can tell, of anybody in that crowd leaving Glastonbury and encountering members of the Israeli Defence Force. I mean, literally, physically. Being there, ramped up or amped up by the provocations from the stage, and therefore rendered more likely to attack these people that they are also likely to encounter. If you were, for example, to call for a pogrom while rampaging mobs of violent racists were parading through the streets of the United Kingdom, and you were to urge them to set fire to a hotel that actually exists and outside which they could quite easily convene, then you probably have little choice but to plead guilty to incitement charges. But again, there is a very good living to be made at the Daily Telegraph by pretending not to understand this. So if enough complaints are made, I suspect that a criminal investigation becomes pretty close to inevitable. And I think I heard Jonathan Hall, the government's terrorism advisor, making more or less the same point that we made on this programme yesterday about that notion of incitement. To prove incitement, you'd have to... do you know when I learned this? I learned this in the London riots. So I was really taken aback by the severity of the sentencing. But I had it explained to me, and I came to understand that when you have acts being undertaken in the context of riots or in the context of rampaging mobs, the law will act differently from how it would act to similar behaviours in completely isolated incidents outside of the context of riots and rampaging mobs. So I don't think that this investigation will lead to charges. I could be wrong. But the burden of proof of incitement is, to me, too high. The threshold would be too high for it to be reached by Bob Vylan's chanting of the unpleasant, provocative phrase that he intended people to go out and kill members of the IDF. You'd have to prove that he knew somebody in the audience was likely to be personally harassed as a consequence of these comments. But we shall see. We shall see. The Times letters page is extraordinary because it speaks directly to what I suggested to you yesterday, and I didn't expect to see this on the letters page of the Times, not least because it's only a couple of weeks since they were paying a man wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, former Israeli Defence Secretary, as I explained to you a moment ago, writing an actual column for them. But let me give you a flavour of the letters page of the London Times this morning. What a great many of us really find appalling, to use the Prime Minister's word, to describe the nonsense spouted at a music festival by a band very few had previously heard of and even fewer will remember next week, is that he is more outspoken in his condemnation of this futile and forgettable puerility than he has ever been about the Israeli regime's killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians, including those desperately queuing for aid. This is a letter to the Times, not the Socialist Worker. And that was by a chap called Richard Bryant in London. Also in London, Thomas Saunders writes, I confess to being baffled by the criticism of the BBC for continuing to broadcast Bob Vylan at Glastonbury when the band's singer started to lead a chant of death to the IDF. When a newsworthy event, as this clearly was, occurs during a live broadcast, surely cutting the feed is the last thing a broadcaster should do. It can hardly be interpreted as some form of endorsement. I hadn't thought of that angle. I'm not 100% sure I agree with it, but it's completely at odds with calls for heads to roll and up to the Director General of the BBC, people calling for his head today. Another letter, this one from Pontyclun on the Rhondda. The call for the deaths of IDF soldiers is to be condemned. It was shameful and inexcusable. However, it was almost to be expected given the continuing killing of Gazans by Israel, which is just as inexcusable. I'd go further personally and say it's considerably more inexcusable. In his comment article, Danny Cohen blames the BBC and the organisers of Glastonbury, but omits to mention the continuing attacks on Gaza. We need to get things in perspective. Stafford Trendle in Overton, Hampshire writes, "Sir, it is outrageous for anyone to suggest that the BBC should censor events as they happen. The event was broadcast live. Taking it off air would have given even more publicity to this evil rant. The BBC should not under any circumstances be a party to censorship. The honesty of its output would never be trusted again if it were." Jill Davidson, also in London, writes, Bobby Vylan must be thrilled that not only was his venomous chanting on stage featured on the BBC, but also on the front page of several national newspapers. As a friend of many Jewish people, I am horrified that this publicity was given to him. And on it goes. Peter Cotterill in Sprotborough, South Yorkshire, writes, "Sir, if the politicians scrambling to condemn a minor pop group at Glastonbury had stayed their outrage for a few minutes, they would have seen in the same news broadcast the bodies of children being brought out of the rubble in Gaza, killed by the IDF." That's the one that got me. Sir, if the politicians scrambling to condemn a minor pop group at Glastonbury had stayed their outrage for a few minutes, they would have seen, in the same news broadcast, the bodies of children being brought out of the rubble in Gaza, killed by the IDF. I think yesterday saw the number of Palestinians killed by the IDF since we all started talking about Bobby Vylan move into triple figures. I think we hit the 100. I think we went over 100. Al Jazeera has it 95 in the last 24 hours, but of course you'd go back further to Saturday afternoon to forgive the crassness of this, to start the clock on that. I don't know whether someone at the Times is going to get into trouble for this, whether it ducked under the editorial oversight of the people who decided to give a man wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court half a page in the paper a fortnight ago. But I thought that was, what's the word I want? Illuminating and encouraging, actually. It seemed to be pretty clear that this, and indeed, as Andrew says, thanks for reading those letters, they've actually restored my faith in humanity. And the idea of it being in the London Times seems to me to also be pertinent. So I can't believe now, with sort of 36 hours of room to reflect, I can't, do you think anybody honestly feels more outraged by what Bobby Vylan said on stage at Glastonbury than they do by what the IDF has done since? I mean, how would you describe such a person? Every editorial decision that's been taken in this country, as far as I can tell, apart from perhaps this programme and the letters page of the Times this morning, reflects the idea that we should be as outraged or more outraged by comments from a pop star than we should be by deaths of innocent women and children, and men, of course. I mean, how do you even begin to process that? How do you even begin to process it? And I tried yesterday when I saw those two stories, juxtaposed, settled, sitting alongside each other. Police launched criminal investigation into Bob Vylan and Kneecap Glastonbury sets. Literally next to, actually to the left of. So if you were to be doing it as a countdown, it would actually be the higher story. So in second place, Israeli strike on Gaza seafront cafe kills at least 20 Palestinians, witnesses and rescuers say. I tried to process it. I wrote, this is objectively nuts, but impartial news currently lacks any metric to express that one wrong newsworthy thing is several billion times worse than another. There are people who don't even think that Bob Vylan's comments on the stage at Glastonbury were wrong. I still do, to be clear. I still do think they were wrong. But the actions of the IDF since are several billion times wronger. And I can't quite explain to a confused observer how we have ended up living in a country where those two stories can be presented to the public by the state broadcaster with opposite and equal force. So I'm back to yesterday's question with a little side order of confusion. Do you honestly think anybody, the woman we heard in the news a moment ago perhaps notwithstanding, but can anybody truly be more outraged by the words of a pop star on a Glastonbury stage than they are by the actions of the IDF in the hours since that concert was broadcast? And if they are, what the hell is wrong with them? What the hell is wrong with them? Sir, writes Peter Cotterill from Sprotborough, if the politicians scrambling to condemn a minor pop group at Glastonbury had stayed their outrage for a few minutes, they would have seen in the same news broadcast the bodies of children being brought out of the rubble in Gaza, killed by the IDF. Who is the real villain?